They fired Walter Crain on a Tuesday morning in November in front of 43 people, and not one of them said a word. The production floor of Meridian Industrial went quiet, the way rooms go quiet when something happens that everyone knows is wrong, but nobody has the standing to say so out loud. The compressors kept running, the overhead lights kept buzzing, and Diane Forsyth, who had been Regional Operations Director for 11 months and had never once set foot on the floor before 8:30 in the morning, stood in the middle of it all and told Walter that his services were no longer required, effective immediately, and that his personal items would be boxed and waiting at the security desk. Walter was 38 minutes late. He didn't argue, he didn't raise his voice. He looked at her for a moment the way a man looks when he's already calculated that the math doesn't work in his favor, and then he picked up the small canvas bag he'd brought in with him and walked toward the exit without saying goodbye to anyone, because he knew that if he stopped to say goodbye, he might not keep it together, and keeping it together was the only thing he had left that morning. His daughter was 7 years old. Her name was Fiona. She had her mother's eyes, and her father's stubbornness and a loose front tooth she'd been wiggling for 3 weeks. Walter had promised her pancakes when she got home from school, because that's what they did on the first snow day that wasn't quite a snow day, when there was enough ice on the roads to make the morning treacherous, but not enough for the school board to call it. He had been thinking about that promise the entire drive in. He had also been awake for 31 hours. What Diane Forsyth did not know, what she had not asked, and what no one on that production floor felt empowered enough to volunteer, was that Walter had spent the previous night in the Forsyth family's private garage, on his back under a 1987 Porsche 911 that belonged to Diane's father, Edmund Forsyth, who had brought the car in 2 weeks earlier for what everyone assumed was a routine restoration consult. It was not routine. Edmund had driven it for 30 years, and it had developed a fault in the fuel delivery system that 2 other shops had failed to diagnose correctly. Walter had found it in 40 minutes on a Saturday afternoon. Edmund had shaken his hand for a very long time after that. The car was supposed to be picked up at 8 in the morning. Edmund was driving it to a collector's event in Barrie. The transport window was fixed. The event was the kind that didn't hold spots, and Edmund had made clear, with the particular clarity of a man who is used to being clear, that the car needed to be ready. Walter had been almost finished when the heating element in the garage failed sometime around 2 in the morning. He'd worked the last 4 hours in a coat he borrowed from a hook near the side door, his hands going numb every 20 minutes or so, warming them on a space heater someone had left near the workbench. He'd finished at 6:47. He'd called his neighbor about Fiona at 5:30 and been told, quietly and apologetically, that she had come down with something and couldn't manage it that morning. He'd driven home, gotten Fiona to his sister-in-law's apartment on Gladstone, driven back across the city in traffic that had no business being that bad for that hour, and walked into Meridian Industrial 38 minutes after his scheduled start. Diane Forsyth had been waiting. She had been waiting because there was a client review that morning, a quarterly walkthrough with the Hendrick Group, which had been on the schedule for 6 weeks. She needed the floor operating at full capacity. She needed to project competence, and Walter, whose absence she had noticed approximately 11 minutes after his start time, represented a variable she had not accounted for and did not like. She had not asked anyone why he was late. She had not asked Walter's supervisor, Glenn Abernethy, who had in fact been trying to reach her since 7:15 with exactly that information. She had not checked the overnight log, which would have shown a work order opened at 6:40 that morning, with a notation she couldn't have understood without context. She had seen an empty workstation and a clock, and made a decision she believed was decisive. It was decisive. She was right about that much. Glenn Abernethy found out what had happened from the security desk. He stood in the parking lot for a moment after that, in the cold, looking at nothing in particular, And then he went back inside and knocked on Diane Forsyth's office door. She was on a call. She held up one finger without turning around. He waited. She finished the call and turned her chair and looked at him with the expression of someone who has already moved on to the next thing and is slightly inconvenienced by the return of the last thing. Glenn said, "We have a problem." She said she doubted that given that the floor was fully operational and the Hendrick walkthrough had gone smoothly. He said, "Walter Crain spent last night fixing your father's Porsche. The room did something after that. Not a sound. Diane didn't make a sound, but something shifted in the quality of the air the way it does when a person realizes, all at once, that the story they have been telling themselves has a different ending than the one they thought." She said, "What do you mean he spent last night?" Glenn said, "He was there from 8 in the evening. The heating went out around 2. He finished at 6:47. Your father picked the car up at 7:50. He paused. Walter was late because he had to drop his daughter at his sister-in-law's apartment on Gladstone. His regular childcare fell through this morning." Diane said nothing. Glenn said, "He didn't tell anyone why he was late. He probably figured it wasn't the kind of thing you lead with. That last part was not in the overnight log. That was Glenn's own addition, and it landed the way he'd intended it to." Diane looked at her desk for a moment. Then she said, "Why didn't the overnight entry show up in the system this morning?" Glenn had been waiting for that question. He said, "That's the part I'm still working on." The overnight work order had been submitted at 6:40 in the morning, after Walter finished, because the internal system had returned a permissions error when he'd tried to submit it at 11 the night before. It was a known issue. Glenn had encountered it twice in the past year, and the standard workaround was to enter it manually the following morning. Except that when Glenn had gone to pull the record to show Diane, it wasn't there. It had been entered. Walter had sent him a confirmation message, but the record was gone. Glenn had been careful about how he presented this to Diane because he was not yet sure what it meant. Records didn't delete themselves. He had 2 possible explanations, and he didn't like either of them. A system error he'd never seen before, or someone who had access to the overnight submission queue, and a reason to make sure that record didn't surface when it would have mattered most. He didn't say any of that to Diane yet. He said, "I need a couple of hours to figure out the system side. What I need from you right now is to call Walter." She said, "What do I say to him?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I'd start with the truth." She called Walter from her cell phone, not her office line. He didn't answer. She left a message that was more measured than it was warm, but it was honest. She said she had learned something this morning that she hadn't known when she made her decision, and she needed to speak with him. She said she was sorry. She said that word once, cleanly, without walking it back. Walter listened to the message in his sister-in-law's apartment on Gladstone, sitting on a kitchen chair while Fiona colored at the table next to him, working seriously on something that appeared to be a horse wearing a hat. He played it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the table and sat there for a while. His wife, Ellen, had died 22 months earlier, pancreatic cancer. She had been 34. She had been an electrician who read historical fiction on her lunch breaks and made the best roast chicken Walter had ever tasted, and cried every single time she watched the end of a particular movie about a dog, without exception, every time, for 11 years. Walter had learned, in the months after she died, that grief does not respect calendars or job schedules, or the normal rules of what a person is supposed to be able to carry. He had also learned, more slowly, that the only way through was to keep being useful. To Fiona, to the work, to the people who needed things done correctly. That was what he understood about the Porsche. Edmund Forsyth had brought it to 3 shops and gotten 3 different answers. Walter had found the actual problem because he'd taken the time to understand what the car was, not just what it appeared to be on the surface. That was his gift, and it was also, frequently, his inconvenience. He could not walk past something that was broken and pretend it wasn't. He called Diane back at 2 in the afternoon. She answered on the second ring. He said, "I got your message." She said, "I should have asked before I acted this morning. I didn't, and I'm sorry for that." Walter said, "I should have called ahead. I knew I was going to be late and I didn't call. That's on me." There was a pause. Neither of them was comfortable with the pause, but both of them let it sit. Then Diane said, "I'd like you to come back if you're willing." He said he would think about it. She said, "That's fair." He said, "There's something else." She said, "What?" He said, "Your father's car. The fuel delivery issue I found. That was the third fault. There were 2 earlier ones that got patched without being properly diagnosed. Whoever did the first 2 repairs was working fast, or working cheap, or working without the right documentation. I don't know which, but there's a record of those repairs in the service history, and the parts used don't match the specs for that model year. I flagged it in my work notes. You might want to ask your father where those earlier repairs were done." Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why are you telling me this?" Walter said, "Because it matters. The car is going to need those earlier repairs looked at properly. If your father drives it another few thousand kilometers the way it's currently set up, the patch holds maybe 60% of the time. The other 40% he's on the side of the highway." She said, "You didn't have to tell me that." He said, "No." She said, "Especially not today," he said. "The car doesn't know what day it is." Glenn Abernethy spent the better part of 3 days working through the system logs with the company's IT contractor, a quiet and extremely thorough woman named Vera Holst, who had the particular quality of someone who finds anomalies not offensive but interesting. She found 4 things, in the following order: the original permissions error that had prevented Walter's overnight submission, a secondary log showing that the submission had successfully queued at 6:40 in the morning, a deletion entry timestamped 6:52, 12 minutes after Walter had left the building, and an account identifier attached to that deletion entry that belonged to a user profile that had been inactive for 6 months. She showed Glenn the account identifier and said, "This account was deactivated in May. Whoever deleted the record either had credentials from before the deactivation, or the system failed to properly revoke access. I can tell you which one it is if you give me another day." Glenn gave her another day. What she found at the end of that day was that the credentials hadn't failed to be revoked. They had been transferred. The inactive account had been linked, through a permission inheritance that Vera described as not standard configuration and not accidental, to an active account belonging to a procurement coordinator named Breckett. Noel Breckett, who had joined Meridian 8 months ago, through a staffing arrangement Glenn had not personally overseen. Glenn pulled Noel Breckett's personnel file. He pulled the staffing arrangement documentation, pulled the client contracts that Breckett had been involved with since joining the company. One of those contracts was with a supplier called Alderton Systems. Alderton had been bidding for a component supply agreement with Meridian for 2 years. The contract had stalled repeatedly, most recently because Walter Crain had raised a technical objection to the spec quality of one of Alderton's core components. An objection that had been reviewed, supported by the engineering team, and formally entered into the procurement record. Glenn sat with all of this for a long time. Then he called Vera Holst and asked her to document everything in a format suitable for a formal compliance review. She said she would have it ready by end of day Thursday. On Thursday afternoon, Glenn went back to Diane's office. He closed the door. He laid out everything: the deletion, the account inheritance, the Breckett connection, the Alderton contract, Walter's technical objection, in the order that it had happened, without editorializing, the way you present something when you want the facts to make the argument without any help from you. When he finished, Diane was looking at the desk again. She had a way of doing that, looking at the desk as though it had something to tell her that Glenn had come to understand was not avoidance but processing. She was working through the implications in sequence before she said anything. She said, Walter's objection to the Alderton spec is in the formal record. Glenn said, "Yes," she said. "If Walter is gone, the objection is still in the record, but there's no one here with the technical standing to defend it if Alderton pushes back." Glenn said, "That's the way I read it too," she said. Noel Breckett deleted the overnight record so the termination would stand. Glenn said, "That's what the documentation shows," she said, "to protect the Alderton contract." Glenn said, "Yes." Diane said, "How long has this been in motion?" Glenn said, "I don't know the full answer to that yet. Long enough for Breckett to know Walter's system patterns well enough to time the deletion correctly." She said, "That takes months of observation." He said, "Yes." She picked up her phone and called the company's legal counsel. She explained the situation in the compressed, precise way she had when she wasn't performing competence for anyone, but actually had to use it. She asked 3 questions and received 3 answers and thanked the lawyer by name and hung up. Then she called HR. Then she asked Glenn to reach Walter again. Walter came in on Friday morning. He arrived at 7:52, which was 8 minutes early. Glenn met him at the entrance because Diane had asked him to, and because Glenn wanted to be the first face Walter saw when he walked back in. They didn't say much on the walk across the floor. The floor was running. A few people looked up. One of them, an older guy named Percy, who had worked at Meridian for 19 years and had said even less than anyone else on Tuesday morning, gave Walter a short nod, the kind that doesn't require anything back. Walter gave him one in return. Diane met them in the small conference room off the main corridor. She was standing when they came in, which Glenn noticed. She didn't sit until after Walter did. She said, "I want to tell you what we found." She walked him through it, the deletion, the account, Breckett, Alderton, the technical objection that had made Walter inconvenient to people who had been planning around his absence. She didn't soften any of it. She didn't position herself as the victim of a sophisticated manipulation, even though that was also true. She just laid out what had happened and let it sit. Walter listened without interrupting. He had a way of listening that some people found disconcerting, absolutely still, watching the speaker, taking it in completely. It was the same quality he had with an engine. He didn't jump to conclusions. He waited until he had the full picture. When she finished, he said, "The Alderton spec objection. Is it still in the record?" She said, "Yes." He said, "The component they were proposing doesn't meet fatigue tolerance for the operating temperature range we run in the Northwest facility. If it goes in and we run a full winter, we're looking at stress fractures in 18 to 24 months. Probably faster if we have an abnormal cold snap. The failure mode isn't dramatic, it just degrades. People don't notice until they're deep into a warranty problem," she said. "I know. I read your objection," he said. "Okay." She said, "The Alderton contract is not going forward." He said, "That's good." She said, "I'd like you to come back as lead mechanical specialist, with a formal title adjustment that reflects what you've actually been doing for the past 2 years. Glenn will send you the paperwork." She paused. "I'd also like to formally apologize in front of the team." On the floor. The same place it happened. Walter looked at her. She said, "You don't have to say yes to that part." He said, "Why do you want to do it?" She said, "Because it happened in front of them and they saw it and they deserve to see the correction too, not because it's good optics, because it's right." Walter thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, yes." He said it quietly without making anything of it. On Monday morning at 7:45, Diane Forsyth walked out onto the production floor before the shift fully started. She didn't use a PA system. She stood in the middle of the floor, the same way she had stood on Tuesday, and she waited until the people nearby had gathered enough to hear, and she said, in the same clear voice she had used to fire Walter Crain, that she had made a serious error in judgment the previous week. That Walter had not only had a legitimate reason for being late, but had spent the night before working on behalf of this company at significant personal cost, and that his termination had been wrong and was being rescinded in full, effective immediately. She said, "I should have asked before I acted. I didn't. That's on me." There was a silence. Then Percy started clapping. It was slow, and it was deliberate, and it was the kind of thing that can feel performative when the wrong person does it. But Percy had been at Meridian for 19 years, and nobody questioned his read on things. A few other people joined. Then more. Walter was standing near the east wall. He wasn't looking at Diane. He was looking at the floor, the way a person looks when they're trying to hold something together in a public place, and mostly managing it. He managed it. Later that afternoon, Edmund Forsyth came by the shop. He hadn't been asked to. He walked in the way older men who are used to owning rooms walk in, not arrogantly, but with the settled certainty of someone who has been somewhere long enough to feel entitled to take up space. He found Walter at the workbench, running a calibration check on a pressure system. Edmund said, "I heard what happened." Walter said, "It worked out." Edmund said, "I also heard you told Diane about the earlier repairs on the car, the ones I had done up in Sudbury." Walter said, "The car needed it." Edmund said, "Those were expensive repairs, Walter, from a shop I trusted for a long time." Walter said, "I know, I'm sorry." Edmund looked at him for a moment, then he said, "You could have not mentioned it. You were hardly in a position to be doing anyone favors last week." Walter said, "The car doesn't know what week it was." Edmund looked at him for another moment. Then he smiled. Not a large smile, but a real one. The kind that reaches the part of the face above the cheekbones. He said, "My daughter made the right call, in the end." Walter said, "She did." Edmund said, "She made the wrong one first." Walter said, "She did that too." Edmund said, "That bother you?" Walter thought about it. He turned the thought over the way he turned a component, looking for the specific shape of it, not just the surface. He said, "I have a daughter. She's 7. She's going to make mistakes in her life. The kind that matter, not just the small ones. What I want for her, when that happens, I want her to be able to name the mistake clearly and go back and fix it. Not explain it away, not manage it, just say it and fix it." He paused. Diane did that. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She gets that from her mother. I never quite managed it myself." He stayed another few minutes. He didn't look at the Porsche, which was parked in the corner of the shop, where Walter had left it after the handoff. When he was leaving, he stopped near the door and looked back. He said, "The car runs beautifully, by the way." Walter said, "It should." Edmund left. Walter went back to the calibration. The shop was quiet in the particular way that shops are quiet when the machines are off, and it's just one person working, and the light is doing something good through the high windows. He worked for a while without thinking about anything except the task in front of him, which was the best kind of working. At 4:15, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his sister-in-law. A photo of Fiona at the kitchen table, the loose tooth finally out, gap-toothed grin enormous, holding the tooth up like evidence of something. The caption said, "She wants pancakes tonight, she says you promised." Walter looked at the photo for a long time. Then he started closing up the workbench, and he did it carefully, the way a man does when he knows there's somewhere he'd rather be, and he's finally allowed to go there.